The sky over Los Angeles was gray that morning, the kind of heavy, colorless gray that seems to carry the weight of exhaustion itself. Elon Musk stood by the window of his Bel Air home, staring at the city below. The hum of distant traffic mixed with the quiet buzz of his phone, lighting up every few seconds with messages from lawyers, engineers, and investors. Each notification felt like a reminder that everything he had built was slipping away. The year was 2008. Tesla was weeks away from bankruptcy. SpaceX had just suffered its third failed rocket launch. And Elon, the man who had once promised to take humanity to Mars, couldn't even guarantee that his employees would get paid by the end of the month. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched deep into his face. Maybe, he whispered to himself, it's time to stop. That thought terrified him. To stop was to admit defeat, something Musk had never been able to do. Yet the weight of failure was now crushing him from all sides. His marriage to Justine had ended. The press mocked him as a delusional dreamer. Former friends called him reckless. That morning he poured himself a cup of cold coffee left from the night before and sat in silence. The sound of rain began to patter softly against the glass. Inside Tesla's headquarters, the atmosphere wasn't any brighter. The air smelled of stale coffee and fear. Engineers whispered about layoffs. Investors were backing out. Elon entered the room wearing his usual black jacket, but there was something different in his eyes, a rare flicker of uncertainty. "We have one last chance," he said, his voice low but firm. "If the next rocket fails, we're done. If the next roadster doesn't sell, Tesla is finished." No one spoke. They all knew the odds. Late that night, Elon sat alone at his desk, surrounded by financial reports and launch data. The glow of his laptop illuminated the fatigue on his face. He scrolled through spreadsheets filled with red numbers, losses, delays, debts. Each line was a reminder that his dream was costing him everything: his fortune, his family, and perhaps his sanity. For the first time in years, Elon allowed himself to imagine walking away, selling what was left of Tesla, shutting down SpaceX, living quietly somewhere far from the headlines. Maybe that would be enough. But then, as he stared at the photo of his children on the corner of his desk, something inside him stirred. Their faces reminded him of why he started all of this. Not for money, not for fame, but for a future worth believing in. Still, that night ended in silence. He closed his laptop and whispered, "I can't keep doing this." The next morning came without sunlight. Elon drove through the wet streets of Hawthorne toward the SpaceX hangar. The air inside was cold and filled with the metallic scent of fuel and failure. Engineers moved quietly between massive rocket parts, their faces pale from too many sleepless nights. Gwynne Shotwell, his trusted colleague, approached him carefully. "Elon," she said softly, "you need rest." "We all do." He looked at her, eyes distant. "If this next launch fails, there will be nothing left to rest from." Her silence said everything. Everyone at SpaceX knew they were standing at the edge of history, or ruin. That night, Elon sat in the hangar long after everyone had gone home. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the metal doors. He stared up at the Falcon 1 rocket standing tall under the dim industrial lights. "Just one more," he murmured. "Just one more chance." He didn't know if he was talking to himself, to God, or to the universe. But in that whisper lay the last thread of hope that still held him together. Days blurred into nights as Elon Musk drifted between exhaustion and obsession. Sleep had become a luxury, and food merely a distraction. Inside his office, papers covered every surface: designs, budgets, failed calculations. Every problem seemed to scream the same question. Was it all for nothing? Tesla's bills were stacking faster than cars could be built. A shipment of batteries had been delayed. Investors were pulling out. Even his engineers, the ones who once shared his vision of an electric revolution, were beginning to lose faith. At night, the hum of the city outside felt mocking. Elon would stare out over the lights of Los Angeles, wondering how many of those people below had already written him off as a failure. The tabloids certainly had. One headline read, "Elon Musk's fantasy finally crashes to Earth." Another, "The billionaire who burned his fortune on rockets." In those moments, loneliness became his closest companion. He found himself scrolling through old messages from Justine, reading them like fragments of another life. She had once told him, "You can't save the world if you lose yourself first." Back then he dismissed it as sentimental nonsense. Now her words echoed like a warning he had refused to hear. Elon barely noticed when the clock struck midnight. His phone buzzed, an incoming call from an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Elon, it's Tallulah," said a familiar British voice. There was warmth in it, cautious but real. "I heard about the situation. Are you okay?" He hesitated, unsure what to say. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I'm trying to hold everything together. But I don't think I can anymore." There was silence on the line. Then softly she said, "Maybe you don't have to. Maybe just breathe, one step at a time." That small moment of kindness pierced through the storm of chaos. For the first time in weeks, Elon felt human again. The next morning, he drove to the Tesla factory. The smell of metal and oil filled the air. Workers avoided his gaze, afraid of what his expression might reveal. Elon walked the floor slowly, running his hand along the cold surface of a nearly finished roadster. The car gleamed red under the harsh lights, a symbol of everything he believed in and everything he stood to lose. He paused, whispering to himself, "You're supposed to change the world, not destroy yourself trying." But the world, it seemed, didn't care for dreamers. That afternoon, his financial advisor came to see him. "Elon, we're out of options," he said, placing a thick folder on the table. "We either shut Tesla down or declare bankruptcy before the creditors do it for us." Elon looked at the folder but didn't open it. "And SpaceX?" he asked. The man hesitated. "After 3 failed launches, no one will fund another. You've spent almost all your PayPal money. You've mortgaged your houses. Elon, you've got nothing left." Those words landed like stones. He nodded slowly. "Then I guess this is it," he said quietly. That night he returned home too tired to think. The house felt empty, like an echo chamber of old hopes. He sat in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant city sounds outside. At some point he opened his laptop and began drafting an email, half a goodbye, half a confession. He never sent it. Instead, he closed his eyes and wondered how different life might have been if he'd taken an easier path. A safer one, but deep inside something stubborn still burned. A voice whispered from the depths of his exhaustion, "You've come too far to stop now." He clenched his fists. Maybe, just maybe, there was still one more chance left. What about you, viewer? Do you think Elon should have stopped there, cut his losses and walked away, or was he right to keep going even when everything was falling apart? Share your thoughts in the comments. The following week brought no miracles. Elon's eyes were hollow from lack of sleep, his mind consumed by numbers, deadlines, and fears that refused to quiet down. Every call felt like another nail in the coffin. Suppliers demanding payment, journalists asking for comment, friends avoiding his messages. On a rare Sunday afternoon, he drove aimlessly through Los Angeles, the sunlight sharp against the glass of his Tesla Roadster. For a brief moment, he imagined it was just another test drive, not a desperate escape from his own crumbling empire. He ended up at a small diner in Hawthorne, the kind of place where no one cared who you were. The smell of burnt coffee and bacon filled the air. He sat in the corner booth wearing a gray hoodie, almost unrecognizable. An old man at the next table noticed his distracted expression and said, "You look like someone carrying the weight of the world." Elon gave a tired smile. "Feels about right," the man nodded. "I used to build things too. Boats back in the day. Sometimes the sea just swallows everything you make. But you keep building, don't you?" Something about those words struck him. Elon thanked the man, paid for his coffee, and stepped back outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and red, colors that reminded him of Mars. As he stood there, lost in thought, a sudden flood of memories came rushing back. Pretoria, South Africa. A young boy reading science fiction under a blanket with a flashlight. A boy who dreamed of escaping not just his city, but the limits of Earth itself. He remembered the loneliness of his childhood, bullied at school, misunderstood at home. But he also remembered the spark that never died. The belief that no matter how dark things seemed, there was always another frontier waiting to be reached. That night, Elon returned to his apartment and opened a dusty old box from his early days. Inside were sketches of rockets he'd drawn as a teenager, notebooks filled with wild ideas about colonizing other planets. He ran his fingers over the faded pages and something deep inside him began to reawaken. Maybe failure wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the test every dreamer had to pass. The next morning, he called Gwyn Shotwell. "We're not done," he said firmly. "We're going to try again." She paused, surprised. "Elon, you don't even have the funds for another launch." "I'll find them," he replied. "Sell everything if I have to." And he meant it. Over the next few days, Elon sold one of his homes, liquidated the last of his PayPal fortune, and convinced a handful of engineers to stay, not for money but for belief. Belief that the impossible was still worth chasing. Inside the SpaceX hangar, the atmosphere shifted. Fear gave way to something else, determination. The fourth rocket was already being prepared. Elon walked among the workers, speaking to each one, reminding them why they were there. "This isn't just about rockets," he told them. "It's about proving that we can build a future that doesn't depend on luck or politics or fear. We fail together or we succeed together, but we don't stop." That speech lit a spark. As the days passed, Elon felt a strange calm return. The numbers were still grim, the pressure immense, but now there was purpose again. Late one night, while standing outside the hangar, he looked up at the stars. The air was cold, the sky clear. Somewhere up there, his dream still waited, patient, silent, and infinite. He smiled faintly. "You haven't beaten me yet," he whispered. "Thank you for staying with us until now. Your support means everything. And the best part of Elon's story is still ahead. Because when all hope seemed lost, something extraordinary was about to happen." September 28, 2008, the day that would define everything. The morning air at the SpaceX launch site on Omelek Island was thick with humidity and tension. The ocean shimmered under the pale Pacific sun, but no one noticed the beauty of the scene. Engineers moved quickly, their voices low, their movements precise. Everyone knew what was at stake. This was it, the fourth and final attempt. If the Falcon 1 rocket failed again, SpaceX would be finished. Tesla would follow soon after. Elon Musk would lose everything, not just his companies, but his purpose. He stood on the small control deck wearing a headset, eyes locked on the rocket standing tall against the horizon. Sweat rolled down his neck despite the ocean breeze. He hadn't slept properly in days. His thoughts were a storm of fear and fragile hope. "Stage 1 fueling complete," a voice reported over the radio. Elon closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. Around him, the team worked in silence, aware that one wrong move could mean disaster. As the countdown began, time seemed to slow. 10, 9, 8. Elon's fingers tightened around the edge of the console. 3, 2, 1. A blinding flash of orange and white erupted beneath the Falcon 1. The ground trembled. The roar of the engines filled the air like thunder. The rocket rose, slicing through the blue sky, steady, powerful, beautiful. For a few seconds, no one breathed. Then a voice broke through the static. "Vehicle is stable and on course." Cheers erupted across the control room. Tears filled Elon's eyes as he stared at the monitors, watching the rocket soar higher and higher. Minutes passed. Long, agonizing minutes, until the final call came through. Falcon 1 has reached orbit. Silence. Then an explosion of emotion. People hugged, cried, shouted. Elon sank into his chair, covering his face with both hands. For the first time in years, he let himself cry. Not out of defeat, but of release. Against all odds, he had done it. SpaceX had made history. The first privately developed liquid-fueled rocket to reach orbit. A miracle built from failure, debt, and sheer willpower. When he finally looked up, his voice trembled. "We're going to Mars," he whispered. "One day we'll go to Mars." That night, as the celebration died down, Elon stepped outside alone. The tropical air was still, the sky full of stars. He could hear the faint laughter of his team behind him, a sound that warmed his heart. He thought of every moment that had brought him here. The sleepless nights, the ridicule, the fear of losing everything. And he realized something profound. Success was never about luck. It was about surviving the impossible long enough to make it happen. Days later, the news spread across the world. SpaceX reaches orbit. For the first time, Elon's name wasn't followed by the word failure. Then another miracle followed. NASA called. They wanted to work with SpaceX, a $1.6 billion contract to supply the International Space Station. The impossible dream had become reality. But even in triumph, Elon felt something shift inside. The victory had cost him more than money. It had cost him trust, peace, and the person he used to be. He looked out at the ocean one last time before leaving the island. The waves crashed endlessly against the shore, relentless, tireless, eternal, just like him. As the jet carried him back to Los Angeles, Elon stared out the window at the clouds. The world would see this as a moment of glory. But deep down, he knew it was also the moment he stopped being just a dreamer and became something else, a survivor. The weeks that followed were a blur of movement, contracts, and congratulations. Suddenly, Elon Musk was no longer the reckless gambler of Silicon Valley. He was the man who had done the impossible. Reporters who had mocked him were now calling for interviews. Investors who had vanished began knocking on his door again. But behind the triumphant headlines, something inside him remained unsettled. At night, he still found himself waking in cold sweats, heart racing from dreams of rockets exploding. He'd stare at the ceiling, wondering when the next disaster would strike. Because success, he had learned, didn't erase fear. It only changed its shape. Tesla, meanwhile, was still hanging by a thread. The company needed funding fast to survive. Elon threw himself into the work, juggling meetings, phone calls, and sleepless nights, driven by the same desperation that had nearly destroyed him months earlier. Christmas Eve, 2008, the world was celebrating. Elon was in his office, staring at the blinking cursor on his computer screen. On the table beside him were two folders, one for SpaceX, one for Tesla, two worlds, both fragile, both his to hold or lose. Then, as if fate had been waiting for the perfect moment, his phone rang. "Hi, Elon. It's the Department of Energy," said the voice on the line. He froze. After weeks of waiting, the news came through. Tesla would receive government funding to continue production. Enough to keep the dream alive. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, a faint smile spreading across his face. Against every odd, both of his companies had survived. Barely, but alive. That night, Elon didn't celebrate. He simply sat in silence, letting the relief wash over him like warm sunlight after a storm. In the following months, Tesla's first cars rolled out, sleek and silent, symbols of a future few believed in. SpaceX continued its work with NASA, laying the groundwork for missions that would one day reach beyond Earth's orbit. Yet, as his empire grew, so did the distance between Elon and the world around him. Friends noticed he laughed less, that his eyes often seemed to look beyond the horizon. One evening, he met with an old friend at a quiet restaurant in Los Angeles. Over dinner, the friend said gently, "You won, Elon, you did it. Why don't you ever look happy?" Elon paused, setting down his fork. "Because winning doesn't feel the way I thought it would," he said softly. "I thought success would mean peace. But it's just another mountain to climb." The friend smiled sadly. "Maybe that's who you are. Someone who keeps climbing, no matter what." Elon nodded slowly, but his expression remained distant. The truth was, he didn't know if he was still climbing toward something or running away from the man he used to be. He returned home that night to an empty house. The city lights flickered outside his window, the same view he had once stared at when everything seemed lost. Only now he was on top of the world, and yet somehow still alone. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood by the window, whispering, "What's next?" In the silence that followed, he realized there would never be a final victory, only the endless pursuit of something greater. He looked up at the stars, the same ones that had guided him through darkness. Somewhere up there, Mars was waiting, red, distant, impossible. And Elon Musk, for better or worse, was still the man who refused to stop chasing the impossible. The victories of 2008 and the fragile stability that followed didn't grant Elon Musk a calm life. If anything, they opened a door to storms of a different kind. Success, he learned, attracted new expectations, louder critics, and a camera that never looked away. Years later, he would remember that gray Los Angeles morning, the one when he nearly quit, and contrast it with the nights he'd spent sleeping on factory floors. Concrete for a mattress, a rolled-up jacket for a pillow, fluorescent lights flickering like a second sunrise. He would walk the lines at 3 a.m., grease smudged on his hands, murmuring to tired engineers, "We're closer than we think." The cars hummed to life one by one, their panels reflecting the harsh light like armor. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt honest. He wasn't a distant tycoon. He was a man trying to keep a promise he once made to his children, and to his younger self with the flashlight and the dog-eared science fiction paperback. But the higher he climbed, the more complex the terrain became. Personal life and public mission collided in ways he couldn't always control. Headlines were no longer about whether rockets would fly, but about who he was, whom he loved, what he tweeted, what he joked about, and where he drew the line between provocation and responsibility. The same audacity that fueled his breakthroughs sometimes set fires he had to put out. On a rain-scented evening, he stood at the edge of a launch pad in South Texas, wind pulling at his jacket. The new rockets towered above the flats like cathedrals to the future, steel and fire baptized by the Gulf air. Engineers argued softly over a valve. Drones buzzed like distant insects. In the fading light, the structures of Starbase glowed with a stubborn kind of hope. Steel rings stacked against the sky, like the ribs of a dream still under construction. He thought about cost, the kind measured in hours and relationships, in apologies given too late and jokes taken too far, in children's birthdays missed because a test window wouldn't wait. He thought about the price of building something that didn't exist before you showed up, and refused to leave until it did. There were quieter moments, too. A late-night drive in a silent prototype down the Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean a black mirror to his left. He lowered the window and listened, not to the car but to the soft rush of wind and waves. The world seemed to exhale. He smiled just barely. For a few minutes he let himself feel not the pressure to win, but the privilege to try. He remembered the diner in Hawthorne, the old boat builder, and the simple wisdom that had slipped into his life like a note under a door. You keep building. He remembered the fourth launch, the roar, the tears, the overwhelming relief. He remembered the empty house and the question he once asked the dark. What's next? The answer, he now understood, was never a destination. It was a posture. Forward. At a town hall with employees, someone asked him how he handled the fear. He paused, looked down at his shoes, then back up. I don't, he said. I make it earn its keep. A laugh rolled through the crowd, but he wasn't joking. Fear had paid rent in his life. Rent in vigilance, in preparation, in contingency plans scrawled across whiteboards at 2 a.m. Courage, he'd learned, wasn't loud. It was repetitive. When the rockets did fail, because they always do sometimes, he forced himself to watch the replays, frame by frame. Not as punishment, but as ritual. The truth is in the debris, he'd say, and then go quiet for a long time. People thought that meant he was cold. Maybe he was. Maybe survival had sanded away softness he couldn't afford to carry. Or maybe he was just tired of explaining that tenderness and relentless discipline can live in the same person. There were nights when he felt the old urge to vanish, to sell it all, to find a small house somewhere with a stubborn garden and a sky full of uncomplicated stars. He'd imagined that life in detail, a kettle on the stove, a stack of paperbacks, the sound of rain on a tin roof. Then the phone would buzz and someone would say, "We think we solved the vibration problem," or "the battery density just cleared the threshold," and the vision would dissolve, replaced by a sketch on a napkin and the twinned thrill and terror of the next step. And always, the faces of his kids, pictures taped to monitors, drawings stuck to the inside of a hard hat, small notes that read, "Good luck, Dad." In those tiny handwritings he kept score differently, not by stock price, not by trending topics, but by whether he could one day point to a horizon and honestly say, "I tried to move it for you." The day he almost gave up never fully left him. It became a compass, its needle spun by exhaustion, betrayal, and self-doubt, pointing paradoxically to endurance. He learned to treat despair like weather, real, dangerous, but passing. You don't argue with a storm. You brace. You keep the lights on. You wait it out and then go outside to see what can still be built. One evening, after a long review, he stepped out onto a balcony above a factory floor. Machines whispered below like a metallic ocean. The sky over the city was a soft bruise, the first stars braving the haze. He rested his hands on the rail and let his breath slow. "If you ever quit," a voice inside him said, "make sure it's because the dream is finished. Not because the night was hard," he nodded, as if answering a companion only he could hear. The night was hard, but the dream, electric roads and interplanetary homes, solved problems and stubborn new ones, was not finished. He turned back toward the lights, toward the people waiting, toward the work. The man who had once whispered, "I can't keep doing this," now whispered something else. "I'm still here." And for a world that had bet against him more than once, that simple statement changed everything.